Okay, we're going to transition to a panel that is terrific and multi-sectoral, leaders from the US, Canada, and Mexico with dozens of years of combined experience thinking about these issues and thinking about them both in national terms, but also in cross boundary terms. Our guest from Mexico, Martha Delgado Peralta, is joining us with a prepared presentation. We're going to do that, and then I have the pleasure of introducing our panelists, Secretary Sally Jewell and Harvey Locke from Canada. But first, we're going to hear from Martha Delgado Peralta. She's the Vice Minister of Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights at Mexico's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She's a nationally and internationally renowned environmentalist with over 29 years of professional experience in the public sector and NGOs. In 2019, she was the president of the first session of the UN Habitat Assembly and became Sherpa for Mexico before the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy, a position she proudly holds to this day. So we're going to hear from Vice Minister Peralta, then I'm going to come back and introduce Secretary Jewell and Harvey Locke, and then we're going to get into conversation. So if the technical people do this all well, we'll go right to that.
It is an honor to be here today. I thank the Salazar Center for North American Conservation for inviting us to provide a brief message regarding perspective and impacts on conservation seen from the multilateral sphere. I wish success and great results derivate from the celebration of this International Symposium on Conservation Impact. And I would like to remember that the government of Mexico reinforced its commitment to conservation in last December 2020 by announcing its adherence to the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People, whose main objective is precisely to promote the conservation of 30% of the planet's land and sea surface by 2030. Objective shared by the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy. The main objective of Mexico at The Hague, in addition to contributing to the land protection, is to promote the sustainable management of these territories as well as other effective area-based conservation measures. In this context, more than 30 countries from all regions of the world have agreed to join forces in the fight to stop the loss of biodiversity and increase the protection of natural areas around the world. In addition, Mexico has, as a country, member of the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy, actively pushes the new ocean action agenda domestically. This means that we aim to comply our commitment to transit to 100% of the waters under national jurisdiction managed in a sustainable way by 2025, guided by sustainable ocean plans. The last undoubtedly implies strengthening and expanding areas of fishing refuge, marine protected areas, and to apply measures that promote the sustainable use of our fishing communities, sustainable and regenerative tourism, among many other activities. Effective communication and coordinated action among all stakeholders, including the private sector, academia, subnational and federal governments, indigenous people, youth, and civil society organization is crucial to reach our goals in terms of conservation, well-designed public policies, and positive field results. To give you just a recent example and towards establishing the new biodiversity goals, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources, and the National Commission of Water, and the National Commission for Knowledge and Use for Biodiversity, the CONABIO, and also the National Institute of Statistics and Geography, and the Office of the Presidency of Mexico, with WRI Mexico and WWF, we carried a first effort to identify and analyze the area-based measures, terrestrial and marine, that are implemented in Mexico for protection, restoration, and sustainable use. The objective of this analysis is to identify these measures of protection, restoration, and sustainable use that exist in a country to contribute as Mexico to the fulfillment of the international commitments to be adopted for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, also the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda. And also it is a part of a high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy commitments, as well as other agendas that we are managing as our international activism related to sustainable development and human well-being. Let's not forget that area-based measures contribute to the conservation of ecosystems, habitats, and corridors, to the recovery of threatened or endangered species, and also to maintain ecosystem functions and environmental services. To increase the resilience of ecosystems and communities is also helpful, and as well as the well-being of the population through the diversification of sustainable productive projects. The mentioned study, pioneering, a unique in its kind, seeks to publicize the areas of opportunity in which work should be done to achieve practical contribution to the sustainable development land and marine territory. All the last virtues in benefit of our people, so as to leave no one behind. My past statements bring me to highlight that we must never forget the transboundary characteristic of the conservation labor. Protection and conservation actions must always be aligned with its inherently cross-border nature. So nature knows no boundaries, no walls. Seen from my perspective, the best way to achieve successful conservation efforts via the multilateral actions, but also the bilateral activism. Conservation should not respond to any physical or political border, because it is not only a domestic task, but also a regional and global one. And this is why it is not only necessary but urgent to identify and coordinate national and international efforts to advance in the fulfillment of the commitments under the Convention on Biological Diversity and also the 2030 Agenda related to sustainable use, restoration of ecosystems, and protection of biodiversity. Now more than ever, it is clear that the health of humanity is strictly linked to the health of our ecosystems, and the greater the expansion of awareness about the importance of preserving and conserving and using natural resources in a sustainable way, the greater the benefit for everyone. Let us join forces. You can be certain that you will find in Mexico a formidable ally for the benefit of conservation. Thank you very much.
We can all see that Ambassador Salazar will have a tremendous partner when it comes to international conservation and North American conservation in Vice Minister Peralta. And I hope when Vice Minister Peralta meets with Ambassador Salazar, she'll ask him to call back home and to tell Secretary Kerry, Secretary Blinken, and President Biden that the United States ought to join the High Ambition Coalition for Nature. So maybe we'll see that happen with a little push from our Mexican colleagues. It's now my pleasure to introduce our panelists. It's old home week for me. I get to introduce first Secretary Sally Jewell, who served as the 51st Secretary of Interior of the United States under President Barack Obama. During her tenure, she was recognized for using a science-based, landscape-level, collaborative approach to natural resources management. Secretary Jewell also served as CEO of REI from 2005 to 2013, where she became known for her involvement in conservation and environmental protection. Sally's a global board member and served as interim CEO of the Nature Conservancy. She's a lifelong outdoor enthusiast and has demonstrated enduring commitment to conservation and connecting people to nature. After we hear from Secretary Jewell, we will hear from Harvey Locke, who's co-founder and senior advisor for Yellowstone to Yukon and Nature Needs Half. Having worked in nature conservation for more than 2 decades, his writing and photography have been widely published in newspapers, magazines, books, and scientific journals. He's a recipient of a number of awards, including the 2014 Gold Leaf Award for the Canadian Council on Ecological Areas for his lifetime of extraordinary commitment and vision to advance the cause of parks, wilderness, ecological integrity, and landscape connectivity in North America and the world. So first we'll hear from Secretary Jewell, then we'll hear from Mr. Locke, and then the three of us will get in conversation. Secretary Jewell.
Well, John, it is a pleasure to see you on screen, and I hope it's in person before too long. And to meet you, Harvey, I appreciate your good work on the Yellowstone to Yukon, a very, very important area of biodiversity. And I wish Vice Minister Delgado Peralta was able to have a conversation with us, because North America is very critical to conservation, as we all know. I just want to begin to say that today I'm joining you from the shores of the Salish Sea ecosystem, and that is the homelands and waters of the Coast Salish people of both the United States and Canada, and where the interconnectedness between land and sea are so evident and so important. And we've heard from many, including Secretary Holland, that nature knows no boundaries, and we are all interconnected. So as we think about how best do we conserve these important landscapes, I reflect on a saying that I learned from my time at the Nature Conservancy, which continues on the board. And that is pretty simple. It is protect the best and improve the rest. So that's easy to say, but how do we do that? And it really begins with an understanding of what's there. So how do we have shared, reliable data? And that is critical to understanding ecosystems at a landscape scale, and also factoring in input from those who have stewarded these lands since time immemorial. Well, there have been lots of references in the course of this seminar to, or this symposium, to the tools available to do that, and including what Secretary Holland just referenced in the launching of Landsat 9, which will really up the capacity of information on the landscapes from satellites. So that's critical, shared reliable data, but it's a very complicated process to conserve. It has to include areas, not just those under public stewardship, but indigenous stewardship and in private hands. And that encompasses a wide variety of interests, including working landscapes. So how do you make this stick and effective? Well, first, protection has to be representative of habitats and ecosystem types that are resilient in the face of the changes that we see on the landscape. So the species can thrive not only now, but in adapting to future changes. It has to be effectively managed over the long term so that those protected areas remain viable over generations. It has to be durable. So how do you do that? You do it through policies, and you do it through sustainable funding to make sure that you have secure protections in place. And it has to be developed collaboratively. And this is the really hard part, engaging communities, indigenous people, landowners, fishers, hunters, government, and so many more. So there's lots of great examples to draw from. Really good examples in the Great Plains from Canada down into the United States, with buffalo or bison being reintroduced. Tribes are actively involved, NGOs are involved, private landowners are involved, government agencies, particularly in providing stock from genetically pure herds. And we now know how critical bison are to a healthy prairie ecosystem. And there's a lot of people working to bring that back. I worked directly with the government of Mexico on habitat to address the challenges facing the migrating monarch butterflies. Fortunately, what we'd call a charismatic microfauna, a very charismatic insect that captures people's hearts and their attention. We've got challenges with forest habitat in Mexico and illegal logging, big challenges in Canada and the US with agricultural practices and pesticides and herbicides and the removal of those boundary areas where habitat is, that has prevented the effective reproduction of the species. So that's very much a cross-border issue. And then more recently, tremendous amount of encouraging work in the Appalachians, which run from Eastern Canada all the way down to the Southeastern United States. In the US, it's largely in private hands, but NGOs like the Nature Conservancy have done work cross-border, just making sure that those ecosystems between Quebec and Maine are protected, and then some major work with private landowners to conserve lands in the more southern parts of the Appalachians, including working with family forest owners on keeping their land in sustainable forestry by banding together as cooperatives to sell carbon credits from their forests to companies wanting to offset their carbon footprint. So some really interesting and creative things going on. So yesterday, as I was listening in to much of the symposium, one of the comments that struck me was from Harry Licker from the Haudenosaunee and Mohawk nations in Canada. And he talked about how his ancestors were at war with one another. And they created a concept that he called the Great Way of Peace. And he referenced its translation roughly into 3 English words that really resonated with me. And those were respect, equity, and empowerment. And I think there are no better words to describe what we have to do for effective conservation, and that is collaboration. It's about listening to each other. It's about building relationships. It's about agreeing on a common set of facts. And most importantly, it's about finding common ground. Because conservation becomes durable when people across a spectrum of interests see value to themselves and their interests in the protection of places that are important to them. And in my journey as Secretary of the Interior and in business, and since that time, people value nature. Their lenses, which are clouded with assumptions about others and so on, are oftentimes moved away when they build relationships. So if you have the ability to create that common ground, you also need policies and practices that recognize those diverse interests across different groups and strike the right balance to enable that to persist. I will say as a business person that certainty is critical to business. The enemy of business is uncertainty. I don't mind playing by the rules. I don't mind regulations, but don't keep changing them all the time. And that's part of what we heard when I was secretary from business folks. So I want to drill in just briefly on one example, and that is hard work that we did on preserving the sagebrush sea ecosystem. So what is that? Well, it used to be considered kind of a wasteland. But it isn't. It covers over 170 million acres, spanning from the prairie provinces of Canada down through the Great Basin and the Great Plains. Roughly 14 US states are touched by the sagebrush sea. And it is home to 350 very different animal species that are dependent on this unique ecosystem. One of those species we call an indicator species, the greater sage-grouse. And it was a candidate for listing under the Endangered Species Act with a court-ordered deadline to determine whether it should be listed or not by September of 2015. Now, for a state or a business operating in a state, an Endangered Species Act listing is something that people fear because they fear that they will lose control over the ability to manage their lands, and the states feel the same way. So they don't want a listing. I will say that the there are many people throughout those states that depend on working landscapes and economic uses of public and private lands for things like cattle grazing, oil and gas development, mining, including lithium mining for batteries critical to electric cars, electricity transmission, hunting, other forms of outdoor recreation, and of course, property development. So they wanted that to continue. What were the threats? Invasive species, notably cheatgrass, which people in the American West will understand, fire, which is exacerbated by cheatgrass, drought, both of which are accelerating, as we heard from Secretary Vilsack, and we know from just watching the news, disturbance, fragmentation, roads, transmission lines, other forms of development. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which makes the Endangered Species Act's determinations, was very skeptical that we could come to a meeting of the minds across 14 states and all of these different interests to keep the parties together, because the politics were challenging. There was a lot of mistrust. And they had some remedies that would help businesses operate even if there was a listing. But Ken Salazar, for whom this center and symposium is named, understands, I think, down to his bones, the importance of conservation in a sustainable way. He's a fifth generation, I think fifth is the right generation, Coloradan from a ranching family. And his family and his ancestors understood deeply the importance of land for nature, for livestock, and for people. He was under the banner of the flag of Mexico and the flag of the United States as the border moved. So Ken really launched something that was extraordinary. He created the Sage Grouse Task Force in late 2011. He passed the mantle to me when I took over for him in 2013. And there were governors from 11 Western states that were deeply engaged, and their fish and wildlife state folks. We had cattle ranchers, environmental NGOs. Audubon Society was a key player. We had scientists from a variety of different entities. The oil and gas industry was there, mining interests were there, and lots of federal agencies, largely from the USDA and the Department of the Interior. We had committed staff that worked very hard on this. We called them the three Grouseketeers. Sarah Greenberger, Jim Lyons, and Michael Bean. But their focus and their engagement directly had a big impact, and we engaged governors. So every Western Governors Association meeting, we discussed the greater sage grouse, which wasn't exactly on the agenda for the Pacific Islands, for Hawaii and some of the Pacific Island nations, but it was really, really important. And we shared many visits with governors across their territories to listen and to get an understanding of the interest. We heard from ranchers, I want my family to be able to continue for generations to come. And hunters, I want healthy game animal populations and access. And oil and gas companies, I want to know that the resources that I've got under lease that I've paid for, I'm going to be able to develop. Or utilities, I need permits to move energy. And environmental NGOs, we need healthy habitats for animals. And outdoor recreationists, I got to have continued use of public lands and access. And then, of course, the federal and state agencies that have to meet legal mandates and have to fulfill their obligations now, but also for future generations. So it was epic collaboration. And in record time, the dedicated public servants at the BLM and the U.S. Forest Service reworked 98 resource management plans in the space of 3 years, which is unheard of. States stepped forward with commitments, and we gave them flexibility to address the state's priorities. And of course, the Fish and Wildlife Service and the USGS worked really hard on the science. And proud to say that led the Fish and Wildlife Service to determine that a listing of the species was not warranted within the September 2015 deadline, with a commitment saying, we're going to hold you accountable and we're going to review it in 5 years' time. So that was extraordinary and deeply appreciated by the governors and the working landowners. So I think that despite efforts in the subsequent administration to try and revisit these plans, which was not met with appreciation by governors or businesses in the area, I will say that the collaboration paid off, with the states following through and the participants generally sticking to their commitments. So it is a great illustration of respect and equity and empowerment, and how you achieve that through thoughtful collaboration, taking time to listen, build relationships, to find that common ground, and then aligning government policies and laws to support that common ground. And that makes solutions like this one durable and effective in achieving conservation outcomes. So I firmly believe that through collaboration, we can shape a successful economy, which humans demand, and couple that with a sustainable environment, which I believe deeply is essential to our very survival, not just for now, but for generations to come. So I look forward to questions, and John, back to you. Thank you so much.
Well, Sally, that was terrific, and really a great lesson for all of us who are involved in this movement, to think about the collaboration really at the front end and make sure you build those systems of support to get great outcomes. Now I'm going to turn the mic, and I'm going to turn the screen over to Harvey Locke and get a Canadian perspective. You're muted, Harvey.
Hi, John and Sally. What a pleasure and honor to meet you. A pleasure to be part of this important Salazar Center debate or discussion. And also just a pleasure to listen to all the cabinet members speaking this morning. This is obviously a really important event, and I'm thrilled to provide some Canadian perspective to it. I'm joining you from Banff National Park, which is a World Heritage Site and also on Treaty 7 land in Alberta, Canada. And I've had a longstanding interest in this question of transboundary conservation, and also this question about how do we live well in the world, which is really what we're talking about when we talk about ideas like nature conservation. And, you know, Sally said so many important things about the shared species that we have and the shared landscape that I won't repeat them. I just adopt them all. So that saves 2 minutes of my spiel, which is a good thing. But I wanted to get specific about policy prescriptions, such as this idea of protecting at least 30% of the world by 2030, which is a very active global discussion. There's, as a Mexican vice minister mentioned, there's over 70 countries that are part of the High Ambition Coalition to protect at least 30% of the world's land and water by 2030. Canada has signed up to that. We also have another target. And what's interesting, we just had a federal election. And all the three parties that had a chance to win the election had a policy in their platforms about increasing the amount of nature protection. So the Liberals, who won, a minority government, but by a good margin, have 30% by 2030 at least, and an important milestone of 25% by 2025. The Conservatives, who came second and did well in the popular vote, had 17% for sure, which is the old international target, reaching towards 25%. And the Democrats had a commitment to 30% by 2030. That's pretty important because right now Canada is at about half those levels. So this is a big deal. And one of the important things we've learned is working with Indigenous people is a really important way to increase the amount of area we can protect. But we also need to do it everywhere. And so this conversation has been an interesting one because of the, you know, there's basically an approach to conservation we need to take that does conservation everywhere with appropriate strategies in appropriate places. When Stephen Woodley spoke in one of the opening sessions, he talked about the 3 conditions approach. And I wonder if you can put the slide up for me, that I have one slide that sort of is a map of North America. And what this map shows is that basically, like all of the world, there's basically 3 conditions, which is our starting point in 2021 for talking about increasing conservation effectiveness. So in North America, you can see the dark green areas. Those are our large wild areas. Then you can see the dark brown areas. Those are where our cities and farms are. And the in-between is what we call shared lands. This is actually part of a global study I led with people from China and from Australia and Kenya and Europe and the US and Brazil on, you know, what do we have in common? And the whole world has this in common in these three broad categories. So we need strategies that are appropriate to each of those three categories. What you want to do in Alaska or the boreal forest of northern Canada is not what you're going to do in Illinois. And what you're going to do in the West, the Sagebrush Sea or the Yellowstone to Yukon region or, up the Cascade Mountains is different again. And so we need appropriate strategies targeted to each of these places that engages people in appropriate ways. So for example, in the case of farmlands, we need to keep pesticides and nutrients out of freshwater systems in order to keep estuaries healthy. So it's a whole integrated system. We also need to give people access to nature. We need to produce a lot of food. And we have to have our cities flourish. In large wild areas, we know that the primary value is intactness. Keeping these large places intact is essential to the functioning of the planet, whether it be the boreal forest or the Amazon. And in the intermediate areas, we know from a long period of study of conservation biology, that's where we need to have interconnected protected areas like the Yellowstone to Yukon idea, or we need to have large strategies like the one that Sally laid out for the Sagebrush Sea. How do you maintain the values you care about? And the importance of a target like 30 by 30 is that it gives us a specific milestone. We also need to be sure that when we're doing it, we're actually doing something that is real conservation, not doing accounting exercises to try to look like we've met a target. And Sally talked about the indicators of what effective conservation are, about representation and so on. It was so well done, I'm not repeating it. But the big point in all this is a milestone. What we know, and passed at the World Conservation Congress in Marseille 2 weeks ago, was a motion that recognized the science is actually, we need to be protecting at least half of the planet if we want to have a stable functioning planet for species, for people, for climate, for the whole system. So we're talking about interim milestones here as we get to where we need to get, because to be honest, the 21st century is not going well for nature. It's not going well for the climate. And that means it's not going well for people, full stop. And one of the things I've really been interested in is the North American embrace of Indigenous perspectives on how we can think about ourselves a little differently as being one species among many sharing the world with the rest of life rather than the top dog who runs the thing in our self-interest. And this can be a very powerful thing for all of us North Americans to remember that the first people who are here had a pretty healthy perspective on how the world should operate and how they should play a role in it. And I think all of us not only should be talking about dialogue and respect, we should be listening, learning, and embracing some of those knowledge systems as we design our future in the 21st century. So with that, I'll end with this thought that listening to everybody, part of a thing that I've been involved in is developing an idea about how we have a goal for the climate, which is carbon neutrality or net zero. We have a goal for the sustainable development, which is equitable development. We need a goal for nature, which is a nature positive world. We need to set a goal of making things better, not making them less bad, not hoping that the dead species list gets a little shorter, but how do we do something nature positive by 2030? So this vision that we're proposing, and I'm pleased that the Nature Conservancy was part of it all, is this idea of an equitable, nature positive, carbon neutral world. And our conservation efforts should be driving in that direction. How do we make it better? Not how do we do accounting, but how do we make it better and have a better world? So those are what I wanted to share for thoughts.
That's great, Harvey. I wasn't going to do this. I wasn't going to start with politics, but your presentations prompted me, particularly Harvey's discussion about the recent Canadian election. And Sally, your discussion of working with governors, including perhaps most of those governors were Republican governors in the areas on the sagegrass problem. Why is it so different when you come to Washington from the sort of practical conservation-oriented perspective that you see conservatives and conservative governors have across the country? There's difference between the parties, but when you get to Washington, it's like Mars and Venus. And is that a fair description of what your experience was like as secretary? And what do we do about that? How do we bring Republicans into this congressional Republicans in this conservation about protection?
Yeah, Harvey's got his perspectives on Canada, and it was interesting actually being in the Obama administration on the transition from the Harper government to the Trudeau government, and the partnerships that we had changed radically when there was a political change at the top. So politics do matter. I'd say, John, what's really interesting to me, and I'll use a quick story. After I left government, I was visiting and doing some outdoor recreation and doing some speaking in a very conservative state. And I won't share the name, but a very conservative state was so hard on the sage grouse, happened to be at one of the events I was speaking at. And so we were chatting in advance and he said, "God, I miss you." And I said, "You miss me?" Really? You got the White House and the House and the Senate and, your state, and, you should be able to pretty much do whatever you want. Why do you miss me? So, it's a little bit it was a fun conversation. And he said, because the Trump administration is revisiting the sage grouse stuff, and we worked so hard on that, and the oil companies that are active in his state are coming to me saying, wait a minute, why are they looking at this again? We thought we had a deal. And so they're reflecting that concern about uncertainty. Well, if it flip-flops back and forth, how can we make plans for the investments that we're trying to get a return on that we've already made? And I think politics, which is so heated right now, has gotten in the way of governors being able to run their states the way they wanted. And even I'd say on the sage grouse work, it wasn't all wine and roses at the end. There were some states that sued us over the sage grouse work. But one of those states that sued us did it because of politics. Their fish and wildlife agencies were continuing to do the work that needed to be done to protect the species. So I would say whether it is, Washington, D.C., and you're immersed in that, John, just by your proximity and your work, is different than a lot of the rest of the country. But it's not different in that what we hear in the news media and the knocking heads and the othering is true in so many aspects of our society. But when it comes down to place and economics and things that they will hear about from their constituents, like, I want access for hunting, I want animals for hunting, I don't want to be locked out, I want these lands to be protected, I've grown up in these landscapes and fishing these rivers, or whatever. That's what really matters to them. So there's an element of rhetoric, and then there's an element of reality. And I saw reality come out over and over again in this collaborative process, but I had to put up with the politics behind the scenes where they were working with me on the one hand and then saying really negative things about me and President Obama and others on the other hand. And, my skin is a lot thicker as a result of being in government service, but, I wouldn't trade it for the world because of the ability to have impact. So you kind of have to look through that stuff.
Harvey, any reaction? Does that sound?
Well, we Canadians are sort of a milder version. The joke is that we are unarmed Americans with healthcare. That's the sort of, so we have our political divisions as well. But the thing that I observed, and that's what I was trying to get at with my mentioning the three political platforms, that of course is federal. We also have provinces, and our provinces are more powerful than your states. The way our Constitution works, they have more authority. So we still have an alignment to do there that needs to happen to meet national goals. And that can be very challenging because we have this, the two or three of the most economically powerful provinces in the country right now are conservative government. We have a federal liberal government. So, those dynamics often play out for us, not in Ottawa, but actually in the provinces versus the central government level. So we have to do the same kinds of alignments, address the same kinds of interests that Sally was talking about. I think the thing that really interesting, and since we're being political, I'm going to dive right in. In Alberta, our government proposed open pit coal mining in the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. And if you grew up here like I did, like this is a sacred place with all the values Sally talked about. And these go across the spectrum. They are not liberal values, they're not conservative values, they're Albertan values. And the counter reaction to open pit coal mining in the headwaters of our river has been astonishing. It's the largest consensus issue I've ever worked on, of just people all across the board saying, bad idea. We don't need that money. We need fresh water that runs across the prairies because we're getting drier and drier. No matter what your position is on climate change being caused by people or not, you know it's getting hotter and drier, and you know water matters, and you know wildlife matters, and you know for us here in this province, the love of the mountains is a deeply held, visceral, shared value that we perceive ourselves as people who live in a beautiful place, and we're proud of that. And so it was really interesting, and this is still active. They haven't backed off completely yet, but it's a real fight. How those values converged around something, notwithstanding a sense of economic urgency and everything else. No, we're not doing this here. The real challenge for us all is how do we then move that into protection that results in it not flip-flopping back and forth, as Sally said. And there's an example from the US that I really like, which is the Rocky Mountain Front Protection Act. And I think, Sally, you were involved in some of that, or maybe it predates you, I can't remember, but I'm dating myself here. But it was a really interesting thing where the community in Montana came together and said, you know, we want to keep it the way it is. That means adding some to wilderness. That means creating a kind of a new federal designation. And the result was a really good outcome. And that's adjacent to a whole bunch of conservation lands that the Nature Conservancy holds. And so I used to be on the board of the Nature Conservancy of Montana, which is why I'm conversant with this stuff. But anyway, make a long story short, we can do this stuff. But we need to do it. And I'd add something that in addition to seeking consensus, we need outcomes. Okay, we can't just talk, because actually the planet is dying. Species are dying. And, you know, I heard Secretary Holland's marvelous remarks punctuated by the horror of losing over 20 species permanently. That is going on all over the world. The number is 1 million species are at risk. It's like the rivets popping off the airplane while we're flying over the Atlantic Ocean. We can't continue to do this and hope to have a positive future.
Harvey, your story reminds me of the reaction to President Trump's attempt to open up the Atlantic seaboard to oil and gas drilling. It finally united conservatives and liberals in the Southeast United States. Let's talk about international, the transnational context. Maybe I'll throw this first to you, Harvey, and then get Sally's reaction. This is a moment, I think, for the conservation community to better engage communities of color, tribes, other historically marginalized positions. Working across national borders is especially important for tribes and indigenous peoples. How can these communities be really, truly authentic partners and leaders as we work toward the 30 by 30 goals? I know you've worked a lot on this. So what's your perspective on that, Harvey?
Yeah, great question. So the transboundary conservation thing is really interesting because we tend to think of it as, a new challenge. But our countries worked together to create the Migratory Birds Convention 100 years ago. Our countries developed their national park services in huge mutual consultation. There was even a Continental Conservation Congress that Gifford Pinchot and J.B. Harkin were at 100 years ago. So we have a deep history of cooperation. There's a Marine Mammals Conservation Act. And then it ebbs and flows. In my view, it should be flowing hard right now. We should be really stepping up and doing this. In the Yellowstone Yukon corridor, it's an obvious place. We already have alignments for 30 years of people around an idea. We have highway infrastructure we can mitigate. And when you bring the question down to indigenous people or tribes, for example, the Blackfoot and the Blackfeet people are literally divided by the border. But they're still the same people. And the land has always been there. So if you grew up in Montana or Alberta, you know that it's a similar landscape. Somebody doesn't have to tell you that. You already know it because that was the pattern of your life. And in terms of engaging indigenous people, I'm really excited by the buffalo, particularly the bison. Leroy Little Bear, I believe, shared some stuff about the Buffalo Treaty. What's really neat about that is that's a transboundary treaty between tribes driven by them. That's the first one since 1850. And they talk about bringing back the buffalo for multiple reasons, including social, spiritual, economic, and ecological. And living among them again is part of an essential part of their stories. I'm dreaming of a transboundary buffalo herd. I'm dreaming of systems like our river systems. If we thought about the Columbia Treaty renewal, and we thought about it in terms of salmon, how do we get salmon back into the headwaters, which I can almost see from here, where they were blocked by all those dams on the Columbia River, which is a species that's totemic for interior peoples and coastal peoples, just like the bison is the species for plains people. For northern peoples, it's often caribou. That takes us to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And please forgive me, talk about vacillating uncertainty. I mean, for God's sake, protect it, Americans. Just do it once and for all. Pass along Congress, get rid of this 1002 stuff and say, we're saving this. We've done our part on the Canadian side. We have a national park over there. Your turn.
Sally, what are you dreaming of? And how do we have truly inclusive process on this?
Well, I agree with Harvey. I think engaging Indigenous people is absolutely critical because of the knowledge on the landscapes that runs so deep. I know members of the Blackfeet Nation. I was just there actually hiking up Chief Mountain with one of the young tribal members, which you can only do from the Blackfeet side in the company of a tribal member. It was powerful. There are great opportunities to work across the border, and I do think a transboundary herd would be a wonderful thing. I'll also say that it's not simple. I tried to get genetically as pure as it gets Yellowstone bison that were beyond the carrying capacity in the park transferred to the Fort Peck Reservation before I left office. Called Governor Bullock at the time to say, can we please do this? We'll only transfer the males. They've been checked for brucellosis. They're going to be behind a fence. All of these things, they will be quarantined. And I couldn't get that done because of the agricultural interests in the state. So even doing that is not simple if you don't listen to the different interests and try and address their concerns. And they'll say it's about the transmitting of brucellosis, which actually originated in cattle from Europe, but that's also transmitted by elk. That's not really the issue. The issue is competition for grazing lands. And so if we don't address that, we're not going to get to where what you're dreaming of. And I'd like to see that too. On the southern border, Tohono O'odham people also cross the border with their brothers and sisters literally in Mexico. And they did have pretty free access. The border wall obviously was devastating to those human connections and devastating to wildlife connections. And that kind of a political maneuvering that isn't necessarily the only way you can secure your borders. There are many other options. I think we went backwards. I know we went backwards. Listening and creating authentic ways to work together is critical. And it's difficult when the governments change. Canada's had changes, the US has had changes, it's changed back, the pendulum swung wildly, and it's true actually in Mexico as well, in a different way. And conservation either takes priority or doesn't, and that's difficult. I think how you get past that is through relationships on the ground with people that work together. So one other quick example on the southern border, Big Bend National Park, home to a number of incredibly unique species on the Rio Grande River, across from Mexico, where they too have protected large areas in preserves, bigger actually than on the US side between state parks and national parks there. But the scientists work together collaboratively. The species go back and forth. And that has persisted even though governments have come and gone. And I think those are the kinds of transboundary relationships that are really important. And, not to introduce a highly political topic, but I will, because it's, I think, pretty important. Pipelines, right? Keystone Pipeline, Enbridge 3 pipeline, tribal interests, First Nations interests, and concerns, which aren't necessarily just about a pipeline and spills. It is about what's happening upstream and the economics of pipelines and how that might change oil sands development or Bakken crude development, which has long-term consequences for those people downstream. So No, there's a lot of creativity on what tools we have in the toolbox to make this happen. And, if we did what Harvey said, which is recognize the value of intact ecosystems, I think we would have less of these really fiery conflicts, which introduce a lot of uncertainty and political difficulty, and we would build more common ground.
Maybe I can jump in on what Sally just said, John, because I thank you for saying that, Sally. We need to start thinking about what the value of nature is and focus on achieving that, not how do we avoid conflicts over resource use. And this is the shift we have to make. Nature is a value. It's a value for providing all the air we breathe, the water we drink, everything. It's also a climate stabilization thing, and it's the home of everything that's alive on Earth, including humans. So given that it's in trouble now, how do we focus on making it better with appropriate strategies in appropriate places? And that will engage different people in different ways. And it will engage Indigenous peoples across the board, but in very different ways. We'll also engage business in very different ways. But we need to focus on being what I call nature positive. How do we get where we want to be, not get less bad than we've been?
Go ahead.
Harvey, John, if I could just jump in with one quick example. The Wilderness Society engaged an outside economic firm to do an analysis in my backyard, the Cascade Mountains, just in Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, which runs east of Seattle, and on what the value was of the forest, not in cut timber, but in ecosystem services. So they quantified that, and they did it in a really conservative way, saying, what do we need then in not having wastewater treatment plants, or not having water reservoirs or dams for clean water because of the ecosystem services provided by the forest? And that number, by the way, was $1 trillion over a 100-year period. So, what is the value of the Bristol Bay fishery over time relative to the value and the risk of the Pebble Mine? What is the value of the fishery in the Yukon River relative to the cross-border mining activity in Canada that impacts that river? I mean, these are the kinds of conversations that we need to have. And then how do you recognize that and potentially compensate for that, or not lease those lands for mining and development because of the downstream consequences? And I think these are, just a handful of the conversations that need to take place to quantify what Harvey was talking about. So it was nice to see the Wilderness Society invest in that kind of analysis.
Some of my colleagues in the sustainable development community are pushing to launch a natural security initiative that links planet with people, and human security being dependent on dealing with nature and preserving nature and dealing with the nature crisis. And I wonder whether you think that embedding, Harvey, your call for a positive agenda for nature needs to be linked to that close connection to human security.
Oh, I think it's a really important, John. And the cool thing is people are starting to think about this who aren't from the traditional, the NGOs who just do nature, which, that's my origin, right? I used to be president of the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, and, I'm a nature nut, I'm a tree hugger, I'm all those things. But, there's a broader spectrum of people now seeing that this problem is not a sectoral problem that the nature community is worried about. It's actually existential at every scale. And so a paper that I had privilege of working on was a paper that was published in Lancet Planetary Health on pandemics begin in stressed ecosystems. If we didn't want to have the pandemic we have now, more intact ecosystems reduces pandemic risk. Having a better biodiversity structure would reduce the risk of Lyme disease, to control the number of white-footed mice. And we need to be thinking about our health as being this One Health question, which is also an interesting idea that's out there. Mm-hmm. One Health, natural security. We all know that we've been lucky. There have been wars, but there hasn't been a war like the one my parents knew or the one my grandfather knew. In my lifetime, I've never had to serve. My dad did, my grandfather did. We all know we have big conflicts in the world. The place that we can come together is around this idea of making peace with nature. The Secretary General of the UN said, making peace with nature should be the top priority of everyone everywhere. And it can be a unifying idea. President Xi of China is talking about eco-civilization out loud. This is not a radical thing. This is him talking about shifting, returning to some Taoist traditions and talking about living within nature's laws. And this, I do a lot of work in China. This is sincere. This isn't, packaging. This is, the Chinese are really thinking about it, and they've already protected 25% of China. Did you know that? Through the Ecological Conservation Red Line. So they're actually ahead of us on this, which is quite astonishing to people and true. There's also the G7 Nature Compact, where all of our leaders of the G7 signed a document calling for, among other things, 30 by 30 and a nature positive world. So that's actually signed by President Biden and Angela Merkel and Prime Minister Trudeau and so on. So I see these things evolving, John, and I guess what I'm encouraged by is that the more you think about it, the shift we need to make is that we're not looking for the sustainable development sweet spot between economy and society and the environment and looking for that little triangle. That's actually not what we're looking for. We're looking to understand that the world is the natural system that we live within. That's the space of human society. And embedded in human society is the economy. And no natural world, no human society, no human society, no economy. That's the hierarchy. And we have to make that conceptual shift. And so that's our security, that's our health, that's our well-being, that's our joy. It's the world we want to live in, and there's the intergenerational transmission. Right now, our generation is looking at young people, and we have to be ashamed of ourselves that we're transmitting to them a world that's getting darker and more dangerous and more unstable instead of a more positive world. People our age, we grew up thinking that the world could get better. The people now are wondering if it ever can. We have to fix that. That's our duty.
There's a rash of polling that's come out. Pew does it globally, but it's the poll after poll is finding that young people are really truly turning pessimistic about the future. And I wonder, Sally, in your work and life and experience, whether you think that turning back towards the idea of protecting nature, I quoted Wallace Stegner calling it the geography of hope. Can that be an antidote to this pessimism we're feeling about climate change, about loss of nature, to be able to kind of point people to the positive direction and the value of a nature positive agenda?
I think there's no question that it can be and it should be, John. When Ken Salazar took over as Secretary of the Interior after President Obama was elected, I went and visited with him and said, the economy is really struggling, 2009. Can you create a modern version of the CCC? CCC 2.0 is what I would have called it. And so he, gave me some thoughts about, well, my focus is going to be around clean energy, and that's kind of my moonshot, which I appreciate. And he did do some good work in that, and we continued it, but we didn't really invest in young people. So I launched a youth initiative, which was a shadow of what I would have wanted to see when I got there, and it was recognizing that if children don't have a connection to nature or a place to go, why would we expect them to prioritize its protection when they get into positions of power? And, it's a sophisticated view that we've been talking about in terms of understanding the interconnectedness, but I would say that's not commonly known, especially in people that have grown up in urban areas with limited or no access to nature. So it becomes an equity issue as well. And even in tribal communities where they may be very rural, there are so many other things that get in the way of their ability to thrive, that get to historical trauma in certainly US, Canada, and Mexico, that make it difficult for them to even carry on the tradition. So I think introducing children to nature is critical. And we worked on it with a kind of a continuum. It's about play. Encourage kids to play. So work with 50 cities across the country on joint programs with federal land managers and cities and the YMCA to bring people together. It was about learning, John and I work closely together on the concept of every kid in a park, which I'm proud to say that the subsequent administration, when they tried to undo it, Congress codified it, which is great. So now it's federal law that every child in the 4th grade, that critical age of sort of 9, 10 years old, gets a free pass to take their entire family to public lands where there's a fee charge. Then it's work, it's service on youth conservation corps and so on. And I think we employed over 100,000 young people over that 4-year period of time. But even that's not enough. But that puts careers on the radar and puts nature on the radar in a way that they wouldn't have had. So, whether it's the Civilian Climate Corps, which is, if it's a $10 billion investment, I think is what's being discussed. That's difficult to pull together. And the CCC took the military and everything else. I mean, I think that kind of effort would turn the tide. I think more so, John, than an initiative around natural climate solutions, even though I think that's part of it. It's like, we don't really need another initiative. We need boots on the ground. We need people understanding. We need them feeling it in their heart. And this is an important way to make those connections that I think, would provide hope, would give people a sense that I am doing something. I can do something about this myself, and I'm committed to doing so.
John, can I jump in on Sally's comment about Indigenous people? We have a process in Canada that went on called Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it was a big deal for us. And this tomorrow is actually Truth and Reconciliation holiday for the first time, about the relationship with our First People that has not been successful or as successful as it ought to be. And unquestionably, it's a national effort to make things better. One of the seminal points made by the commissioners was that there can be no reconciliation among people until there is reconciliation with Mother Earth. And this fundamental point, I think, is a deep one, is that we need to be thinking about how all of our society reconciles at a meaningful level with our planet, with each other. This is where these ideas of equity can really be meaningful, instead of, I'm going to be fair to you. No, we are together in this place. This place is not where we want to be. And together, we're going to think about how we get out of this place to where we want to be. And I think that's a shift for us. And I think it's a shift we could make as North Americans, because we have the similar challenges. We're prosperous, we're well educated, but we have also this foundation of Indigenous peoples that we haven't gotten right. So why not make it a great, exciting project to get it right and get our relationship with nature right? They call that the work of the 21st century. Now that would be fun.
Very fun. Thanks for that, Harvey. I've been trying to weave in some of the audience questions into our conversation, but here's, I just want to read one, which is, as the US and Canada are two of the wealthiest countries in the world, how can we pivot to be global leaders in conservation? What's stopping us? What do we need to do to really accelerate a partnership for global solutions?
Well, I'll jump in. Yeah, I sure. I would say we are seeing very real and significant commitments on the part of the private sector in this work. And that is one way to move forward. As the pendulum of politics swings back and forth in all of the 3 countries of North America, the recognition that businesses and wealthy individuals have, that they have an obligation to be part of the solution, I think is kind of putting their money where their mouth is and demonstrating how that can be done. So, whether it's the $5 billion that you referenced, John, and the work on, 30 by 30, that so many foundations, or a few foundations, have contributed a tremendous amount to, or it's, the support on, creative means of financing conservation, not to drive profit, but to drive action. I think those are ways where the business community, which people kind of assume is conservative, but I don't think that that's accurate. I think they're a big part of the solution. And just as, we saw when, at the Bush-Gore election, you actually had a lot of states and businesses and local governments say, well, we're going to do something about this, even if the administration isn't. Same when Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord. And I think that private sector action also gives political cover to politicians. But I don't think we can expect in this current divided environment for politicians to lead. I think we can and should expect those who have been privileged by this economy that we have in North America to give back and be part of the solution.
So I'm going to offer a different perspective. I think government should lead, and I think it's disgraceful that we wealthy countries are not putting more money on the table. We haven't been able to top up the $100 billion climate fund that was promised to make Paris work. And we have got to put up money to protect nature, both at home and abroad. And nature matters in North America at a global scale, and nature matters elsewhere. For example, we need to invest in the Amazon. I've heard President Biden say at times we should put 20 billion in the Amazon. Well, let's go. Let's do it. And while we're at it, let's do the Congo and let's work with Southeast Asia. And also in the Canadian context and in US, we need to protect the boreal forest and keep it intact. If that carbon goes into the sky, forget your climate goals. And we simply can't hide anymore from the reality that that little thing that started somewhere with a bat somewhere in Southeast Asia has crippled our economy, right? It's made us all hide from each other and wear masks. That's just a down payment on our problem. There is no them and us. There is one planet, there's one species, and we wealthier people, we have to share. And so, yes, I know there's difficult political environments, but there's a moral imperative to our own children, as well as the people of the world, that we must step up and put more money into nature conservation, or we're all going to regret it deeply.
I just want to say, Harvey, I don't disagree with you at all. It's more, how do you shame the governments into action by getting the private sector to step up? I think you're absolutely right. If we don't have government intervention, we're not going to get things done. But, that's right on the mark. But I'm glad to see the private sector stepping up in a big way, and I think it helps.
I only have time for one question before we have to kick it to lunch. But there's been several audience questions. I mentioned the $5 billion, Sally, just of new philanthropic funding. So if there's one thing you would tell those people to spend that $5 billion on, what would it be?
Well, I think they're pretty smart. They're going to protect intact nature, and I'm all for it.
Okay. Sally?
I actually think they're pretty smart too, and they've identified the areas which align with the most critical and the most threatened areas that need protection. And in some cases, like in the Bezos Earth Fund, for example, it's around the world, in places like the Congo. For some organizations, it's closer to home. And it's protecting things like the boreal forest. So there's nothing like action that speaks, much more so than words, much more so than initiatives. And I think that's what the philanthropists and the business sector that are involved expect to see.
Well, this has been a terrific conversation. It has elevated my hope about the geography of hope. And I want to thank you both. It's really been exciting conversation and so many great ideas. I think all the audience shares with me a great deal of gratitude for appearing today and really lighting it up. Thank you both.